Russian forces in armoured vehicles reached the Ukrainian capital Kyiv. Ukraine's army says it continues to fight, and a government advisor says 18,000 machine guns have been handed out to people volunteering to defend the city. Ukrainian troops take up defensive positions to defend the capital. It follows a night of airstrikes and explosions over the city as Russian forces appear to close in on the capital. Damage in Kyiv's residential neighbourhoods after reports of missile strikes and an aircraft being shot down. Families shelter underground for protection in Ukraine's metro stations amid warnings of further strikes.
The most powerful forces in the world watch from afar. Have yesterday's sanctions persuaded Russia? We see in our skies and feel on the ground that they are not enough.
The Kremlin says it's prepared for talks with Ukraine.
No one is going to occupy Ukraine. The goal of this operation is there in the open, to demilitarize and denazify.
NATO reiterates its support for Ukraine and condemns Russian aggression.
Moscow bears sole responsibility for the deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion.
Thousands continue to escape from the capital, while many arrive at Ukraine's western borders with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania. Russia bans all British airlines from its airports and airspace following the UK decision to prohibit Russia's national airline Aeroflot from Britain. And football's European governing body UEFA moves this year's Champions League final from St. Petersburg to Paris. And Formula One cancels this year's Russian Grand Prix.
We begin with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. A Kremlin spokesperson says Russia is ready to send a delegation to the Belarusian capital Minsk for talks with Ukraine. Before that announcement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin showed their willingness to restart diplomacy. Zelensky's video statement on Friday came as Russian troops pressed their offensive on the Ukrainian capital and advanced into other areas.
I'd like to address the Russian president again. Fighting is going on in the entire territory of Ukraine. Let's sit down for talks to put a stop to people dying.
China's foreign ministry announced Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping had talked over the phone. Putin told Xi Russia is willing to hold high-level talks with Ukraine. An advisor to the Ukrainian interior minister said the country was ready to defend Kyiv with anti-tank missiles supplied by other nations. Ukrainian media reported multiple explosions in Kyiv on Friday. President Zelensky said at least 130 people have been killed and more than 300 wounded. The Ukrainian Defense Ministry said the country's airborne assault troops blew up 3 bridges to prevent a column of Russian forces advancing on the capital. A senior U.S. Defense Department official said 3 lines of Russian troops and military forces were moving swiftly toward Ukrainian cities, with 2 of them headed for Kyiv. He cautioned it's the initial phase of a large-scale invasion. A Russian Defense Ministry spokesperson said their paratroopers had captured the territory around the defunct Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Ukraine's nuclear agency said it was recording increased radiation levels from the site, but it could not determine the reason. In Ukraine's second biggest city of Kharkiv, people including young children crowded into a subway station that's serving as a bomb shelter. Some are fleeing their homes by train, car, and even on foot to seek safety in neighboring Poland. The UN Refugee Agency said the humanitarian cost of the invasion will be devastating, adding there are no winners in war, but countless lives will be torn apart. Now, the ambassadors of Russia and the United States to Japan have held separate news conferences at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan. Russian Ambassador Mikhail Galutin on Friday defended the invasion by saying the main purpose of the offensive is to protect citizens in eastern Ukraine. He said they faced humiliation and genocide by the government in Kyiv.
The operation does not direct it against the Ukrainian people. We work only on military facilities of Ukrainian army.
The United States, the European Union, and the group of 7 countries, including Japan, have responded by announcing sanctions on Russia. The ambassador criticized the moves, saying there will be damage for both sides. He called the sanctions mutually unbeneficial. The U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, criticized Russia, saying over the past 36 hours, the world has watched the unprovoked attack on Ukraine. He referred to President Putin's warning his country remains a strong nuclear power. Putin said a direct attack on Russia would lead to defeat and terrible consequences for any potential aggressor.
President Putin has threatened the world with the use of nuclear weapons, which has particular resonance here in Japan, as you have experienced the horror of nuclear weapons. We cannot and will not let this aggression stand unanswered.
The ambassador said the international community must work together to tackle the crisis. Now, for more on Russia's invasion and the outlook for the conflict, I earlier spoke to Higashino Atsuko. She's an associate professor of international relations at the University of Tsukuba. We're now into the second day of Russia's invasion, and more information is trickling in. So from what you can make out, how far has Russia advanced?
Yes, it seems to be a full-scale devastating war going on all over Ukraine. And I think I can point out three things in particular. The first one is that Russia is attacking a very vital infrastructure within the territory of Ukraine. Not only military base, but also power plants, airports, nuclear plants, just as introduced by you, including Chernobyl. So it is getting to be really serious. And secondly, Russia is attacking major cities, again, just as introduced by you. And Kyiv is particularly under attack. Russian tanks are rolling around Kyiv town. So I think many people started to say that it is will be in this very serious situation within 1 or 2 days. And thirdly, civilians seems to be under attack as well. So by now, it is really difficult to believe President Putin's words that Ukrainian civilians are safe. They are not at the moment. And we still don't know how many casualties they have, but still we can just say that it is really serious already, and it is getting to be serious even more.
And Professor, what do you think Russia will do next? What's the next stage?
Yes, I think Russia is obviously scaling up the war even more. And just as introduced by you, the very horrifying beheading operation is planned by Russian administration. The information was leaked by the U.S. administration that the Russian is listing up all the important politicians and important people within the Ukrainian administration. And it seems that Vladimir Zelensky is listed as number 1, his family as number 2. So we already know that Russian government is trying to topple the Ukrainian current administration, not only by driving them away, but by killing them. So I think the Ukraine is under danger, really.
Well, we have also been reporting people in Ukraine are fleeing to Poland and other places. And the UN says 100,000 Ukrainians have fled their homes. So does this mean we will be facing a refugee crisis in Europe?
I'm afraid so. I think we are facing the new European refugee crisis from now on. Maybe it is happening already, but it is getting to be even more serious. I think the U.S. Army is in Poland in order to help Ukrainian people who is crossing border into Poland. And it is getting to be so serious because it is the situation is like a refugee crisis, which happened in 2015 and 2016. At that time, it was a refugee influx outside of Europe, but it is now it is the influx of refugee within Europe. The situation is really difficult, and I think European countries, including Poland and Baltic countries, are really trying to do their best in order to receive the influx of the huge number of migration.
And one final question for you. At this point, what options do NATO, Europe, and the United States have?
NATO had an emergency meeting already, and they are still invoking Article 4 in order to have a consultation process in order to cope with this very difficult situation. And as you introduced as well, Europe and United States is scaling up their sanctions. But it is really important by now to know what President Putin is up for, what President Putin needs, what his final goal, what he's trying to negotiate with Western countries. We don't still know anything about this at all. So within 1 or 2 days, we really need to set up the situation where they can talk about a concrete solution with President Putin. But I don't really think that President Putin is ready to talk to them.
Now, people and governments around Southeast Asia are adding their voices of opposition to the Russian invasion. In Thailand, dozens of protesters came out to express their outrage.
People gather here in front of the Russian embassy in Bangkok, demanding Russia to stop the aggression.
Thais and Ukrainian residents were seen waving placards of the Ukrainian flag, as well as caricatures of Putin's face.
And my friends right now spend this night in metro shelter because of the bombings. This is not only military fight between military people. They're bombing civilians. I want the whole world. I want Thai people. I want people in other countries know what we are going through.
We are here as fellow humans and activists who don't want war. I am worried about how Ukrainian people will suffer from this war.
On Thursday night, Indonesian President Joko Widodo posted a message on Twitter. It said, "Stop the war. War brings misery to mankind and puts the whole world at risk." The current chair of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen. He held a news conference following a meeting with Malaysia's Prime Minister. He said they discussed the crisis and their desire for a peaceful solution. Japanese Prime Minister Kishida Fumio has also criticized Russia's actions in Ukraine. At an upper house committee meeting on Friday, Kishida spoke about 2 separatist regions in eastern Ukraine. He described Putin's recognition of the self-proclaimed republics as states as a violation of international law. He said that invalidates Moscow's claim it took military action at the request of the regions. Kishida also spoke about bilateral ties with Russia. Tokyo and Moscow never signed a peace treaty after World War II because of a dispute over 4 Russian-held islands. The Japanese government maintains the islands are an inherent part of Japan's territory. It says the islands were illegally occupied after World War II.
I think it is important to firmly implement the sanctions and make clear that the cost of violation of international law is high. I believe I should refrain from talking about the territorial issue for the time being.
Japan and Russia have been negotiating for decades to solve the issue and conclude a peace treaty. Turning now to the coronavirus situation here in Japan, where daily case numbers remain relatively high. But there's a potential game changer in the fight against COVID-19. A Japanese drug maker has applied for fast-track approval for the country's first domestically developed oral treatment. Health authorities across Japan reported more than 65,000 new infections on Friday. That's about 40,000 less than the peak earlier this month, but the pace of decline has been slow. More than 30 prefectures, including Tokyo and Osaka, remain under quasi-emergency measures. The drug, developed by pharmaceutical firm Shionogi, could be Japan's first locally made COVID-19 pill. Researchers held a clinical trial involving over 400 patients with mild to moderate symptoms. They say after 3 doses of the drug, the proportion of subjects with a positive viral load decreased by up to 80% compared to a placebo group.
A large number of people over the age of 12 with mild symptoms can benefit from the drug. It might make it like treating a flu patient. You take the medicine, rest for several days, and then go back to work.
Shionogi says it plans to produce enough doses for more than 10 million people annually. Japan has been struggling to secure oral medications for the disease, as both pills the country has authorized so far were developed by U.S. makers.
11時の NHK ニュースです。ロシアによるウクライナへの軍事侵攻を受けて NATO 北大西洋条約機構は緊急の首脳会議を開き、ヨーロッパ東部で不測の事態に迅速に対応するため即応部隊を派遣することを決めました。 NATO は25日オンラインで緊急の首脳会議を開き、ロシアによるウクライナへの軍事侵攻を受けた今後の対応を協議しました。ストルテンベルグ事務総長は会議の後の記者会見で、 NATO の一部の加盟国と接するパートナー国が全面的な侵攻を受けている。ヨーロッパにおいてこの何十年もの間で最も深刻な安全保障上の危機だと述べ、強い懸念を示しました。 NATO は声明でウクライナに近いヨーロッパ東部の防衛体制を強化することで加盟国が合意したとした上で、不測の事態に迅速に対応するため高度な能力を備えた即応部隊を派遣するとしています。部隊の規模や派遣先は具体的には明らかにしていませんが、ロシアがウクライナ国内で軍事侵攻を続ける中、自国の安全保障に不安を強めているヨーロッパ東部の加盟国の求めに応じた形です。韓国大統領選挙の主要候補によるテレビ討論会が行われ、北朝鮮への対応をめぐってウクライナ情勢も引き合いに論戦が交わされました。与党の候補が朝鮮半島の緊張を高めることなく安全に管理していくべきだとして、朝鮮戦争の終戦宣言の重要性を訴えたのに対し、最大野党の候補はアメリカとの同盟に基づく強い抑止力がなければ平和は維持できないと強調し、立場の違いが鮮明になりました。来月9日投票の韓国大統領選挙を前に、昨夜主要な4人の候補によるテレビ討論会が外交や安全保障などをテーマに行われました。この中で北朝鮮への対応をめぐって論戦が交わされ、革新系の与党共に民主党のイ・ジェミョン候補は、ウクライナの状況は深刻だ、重要なのは戦わずに済む平和だと述べました。その上で朝鮮半島の緊張を高めることなく安全に管理していくべきだとして、ムン・ジェイン政権が提案してきた朝鮮戦争の終戦宣言の重要性を訴えました。これに対し保守系の最大野党国民の力のユン・ソギョル候補は、ロシアとウクライナの停戦合意は結局守られなかったと反論しました。そして確固とした抑止力と先制攻撃能力の確保によって戦争を防ぐことができると述べ、アメリカとの同盟に基づく強い抑止力がなければ平和は維持できないと強調し、北朝鮮をめぐる立場の違いが鮮明になりました。一方、日本との関係については両候補ともに自ら言及することはありませんでした。今日未明、秋田県由利本荘市の木工所で建物3棟が焼ける火事があり、焼け跡から2人が遺体で見つかりました。この木工所を経営する男性と従業員の合わせて2人と連絡が取れなくなっていて、警察は亡くなったのはこの2人とみて確認を進めています。今日午前2時ごろ、秋田県由利本荘市玉野池にある木工所から火が出ていると近くに住む人から消防に通報がありました。消防車など9台が出動し、火はおよそ6時間後に消し止められましたが、敷地内にある建物3棟が焼け、焼け跡から2人が遺体で見つかりました。警察によりますと、火事の後、この木工所を経営する横山次夫さん80歳と従業員の女性1人と連絡が取れていないということです。横山さんの自宅は木工所とは別ですが、敷地内の建物で寝泊まりすることがあるということです。警察は亡くなったのは横山さんと従業員の2人とみて確認を進めるとともに出火の原因を調べています。現場は由利高原鉄道の小吉駅から南東におよそ600メートル離れた住宅などが点在する地域です。11時の NHK ニュース、大野誠也がお伝えしました。時刻は11時5分です。
Now to Russia, where anti-war protests have broken out across the country and hundreds of people have been arrested. All of this happening as more sanctions have been announced against Russia's Vladimir Putin. ABC's foreign correspondent James Longman now with the latest from Moscow.
Yeah, hi, Kira. Sanctions really are heating up now. We've had it confirmed that the European Union and the UK are going to sanction Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Vladimir Putin himself. This has never happened before. It is an asset freeze, which basically means they can't get hold of any money they might have across the European Union or in the UK. It is, I would say, more symbolic than anything. Very wealthy people can often have assets in other people's names. We don't know if that's what Vladimir Putin and Sergei Lavrov do, but certainly on a symbolic level, this is pretty major. The other thing that Europe is considering, and this would actually be a big sanction, very disruptive to Russia, is take them off the SWIFT financial system. Now, this is a system which enables countries and international corporations to pay one another. It's a payment system. If Russia is taken off it, it then makes life very, very difficult for trade and could have a significant impact on this country. They thought, in fact, that Europe was going to do that in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. And for that reason, Russia came up with a system called Mir. It's a card which you can use for payments. The government can pay you directly. Pensioners are paid through Mir, for instance. And that's why they created it. So there is a way, kind of, for Russia to get around it domestically. But internationally, this is huge. It could be a massive, massive impact on the economy. It's what Ukraine has been asking for. And I've got to tell you, sanctions already feel like they're starting to pinch here. I mean, we've been trying to make payments at our hotel, and we found that very difficult. And I was on the streets last night at protests, and there were young people out very angry that Vladimir Putin has done this. I'd say that you know, a good majority of Russians still back Vladimir Putin because they watch so much state media, but young people specifically are upset about it. And I spoke about the sanctions with one, and he said, well, yeah, it's all very well to sanction the very rich and the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin, but what it means to me is that I can't maybe get a visa to go and study abroad. I can't buy the stuff I usually buy when I'm here. Electronics, for example, have gone up overnight in one major department store 30% because the ruble has crashed so much against the dollar. So regular Russians are going to start really feeling the pinch here. Car parts for cars they like to drive that are from Europe or the United States, not going to be possible to get hold of. Aeroplane parts is actually one of the things that's going to be really hit. Aeroflot now, the carrier, cannot fly over Europe, cannot go to the United Kingdom. I mean, this is pretty serious, and Vladimir Putin likes to say that sanctions don't hurt, but this is going to be difficult to argue, and if it goes on for some time, Russian people are going to start to feel the squeeze in a serious way, and the argument that sanctions is just something that we have to bear as a Russian nation against the aggression of the West might not be an argument that Russians could put up with for too much longer. So the sanctions that we're hearing about now, I think, are pretty serious. Kira?
James Longman from Moscow, as always. Thank you.
I want to bring in Tom Bossert. The NATO alliance says that there was a price to pay here. And Tom is a national security analyst and former White House Homeland Security advisor. Tom, thanks for being with us. It's always good to discuss this with you. What do you make of NATO activating its response force for the first time in history? What exactly does that deterrence and defense mean in this particular role?
I think it's an incredibly wise move. I'd have recommended it. In fact, I'm not surprised by it at all. What we're seeing now is Putin in a completely unpredictable use of force right on all of their borders. So at this stage, it's only almost obvious that NATO activate this force. There's so much room for miscalculation here. In a lot of ways, Putin has let the genie out of the bottle. We can have Russian jets incurring, flying into other airspace, NATO airspace, Turkish airspace, Polish airspace, drawing fire and leading this thing into directions that we can't control. His military will take actions even without his permission if that happens, and it could spiral. So NATO has an obligation here to, kind of circle the wagons.
Yeah, and Tom, we heard today from the Czech Republic that the Czech Republic and Poland restricting airspace to Russian carriers. The Russians do not have superiority over Ukraine. Ukrainian air defenses are still working. How significant is that for this fight against the Russians?
It's significant for, I guess, two reasons. One, it's a bit surprising that they haven't yet carried that out. It's usually the first step or one of the early steps in the Russian playbook, or really, I think, in any military playbook, or at least that's what most of the generals have been saying. We've seen this play out in the past. There's this acronym in Russian military planning called SOD-SIT, where they go after strategically damaging all of the enemy's critical infrastructure targets. It's pretty standard in their military planning playbook, so I suspect if they really want to, they will do it. I think it reveals, though, at least to me, that Putin does not have a clear military objective. At least it's not clear to any of the observers that I talked to. We don't know what he wants to achieve or whether he has the force adequate to achieve it and sustain it. If he really wants to take on maintaining control over Ukraine, given what we've seen in the defiant eyes of the Ukrainian people, he better have more forces ready to stay there longer. And I think he's got to decide whether he wants that objective. If he does make that decision, they'll take out air defense systems pretty quickly.
Tom, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said that NATO members would need to discuss whether a cyber attack against a NATO ally would then trigger that Article 5 response from the alliance. Talk about that for a second. What might that response look like?
Yeah, this has been brewing for a very long time. In fact, one of the NATO members, Estonia, many people will remember, they were attacked, a cyber attack that devastated their economy and their government systems by Russia, and they're a NATO member, and they asked NATO to consider that an act of war that would trigger the collective defense obligation under Article 5. And in fact, NATO chose not to take that action as a justification to attack further Russia. That's been a pending debate ever since. I think context here matters. So if that cyber attack causes physical harm, loss of life, and if it's done with the backdrop of this threatening buildup of military forces, I think NATO will view it differently. But there'll not be anybody arguing lightly to take any small pinprick cyber attack as a justification to get into war with Russia. It'll have to be something significant, but it certainly qualifies. And I'm glad that she said they're discussing it, because whether it's a cyber attack or a missile, if it kills people and destroys your territory or your possessions, that's grounds for defending yourself, and it's grounds for a collective defense.
President Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Zelensky again today, and after that conversation, Zelensky tweeted that they discussed strengthening sanctions, concrete defense, assistance, and an anti-war coalition. What does he mean by that, and what role could U.S. forces play in that kind of coalition?
Well, I can see a lot of U.S. force deployment to take up the backfill roles of other European forces if the Europeans start to send direct military aid into Ukraine. I think the president's been pretty clear, and at this point, even if he changed his mind, I don't know if he's got the domestic support for sending American forces directly into Ukraine. I think that what he discussed, though, on these sanctions being strong enough or weak enough is a really unfortunate sign of the stress that the Ukrainian people are under. I don't think any additional sanctions will have the immediate effect that President Zelensky is seeking, although I don't blame him for asking. We should pretty much try anything at this stage. I think instead most of these sanctions are designed to punish Russia and to attack their operating budget so that they can't sustain this for a long period of time. That's not very satisfying to people who are in harm's way watching their neighbors being killed, but it's not a direct defensive tool, and I think Zelensky is trying to apply it in that way.
And Tom, you're talking about the stress that Ukrainians are under. The UN says hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are on the move through the country, whether it's from the Donbas region all the way over to where I am in Poland because of this Russian invasion. They're talking about tens of thousands of them have already crossed into other countries. How is this, what is obviously going to turn into some sort of refugee crisis, how is that going to affect Europe and the U.S.?
It's going to strain everyone's ability to take care of their fellow man. We're going to see European countries having to accept a large diaspora of fleeing Ukrainians. All of us want to. American and European hearts are often larger than our than our bread baskets. So I'm not afraid of the willingness of the European host countries or American host countries, but there will be an adjustment period there where you handle large inflows of people. You have to find housing and food sources adequate to take care of their needs. And remember, this is all happening in winter for a reason. I think you're seeing a lot of European hesitancy to turn on certain sanctions and address the SWIFT issue because, like it or not, they are dependent on Russian heating, oil, and gas. And so you don't want to freeze people to death. You want to make sure that there's a flow of energy source, and you want to make sure that these refugees have a place where they can find shelter and protection from the shelling. So I think that we'll see a generous community, a generous global response, and some pretty significant suffering in the interim.
Yeah, and we're seeing that happening here now in Poland as Poland welcomes those refugees, even in lines that are miles long. Tom Bossert, always good to talk to you. Thanks for the expertise.
President Biden made history today, nominating the first black woman to the highest court in the land, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Here she is, as she addressed the American people today.
Justice Breyer, in particular, not only gave me the greatest job that any young lawyer could ever hope to have, but he also exemplified every day, in every way, that a Supreme Court justice can perform at the highest level of skill and integrity while also being guided by civility, grace, pragmatism, and generosity of spirit. Justice Breyer, the members of the Senate will decide if I fill your seat, but please know that I could never fill your shoes.
For more, let's bring in ABC News contributor and professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Leo Wright-Rigger. Thank you so much for being here with us. Tell me what this means to you as you listened to the president today and then, of course, listened to Judge Brown Jackson.
Sure. So this is historic. There's no way around it. I mean, you know, there has, in the entire court's history, there has never been a black woman appointed to the Supreme Court, despite that the fact that there have been, you know, innumerable black women that have been qualified to be on the Supreme Court. It wasn't until recently that black women were even seriously considered for the Supreme Court, making the short list. And in fact, Brown Jackson is one of the first black women to make the short list for Supreme Court. It also is historic, I think, in showcasing the breadth of black political thought. So this is the first time. I mean, a couple of years ago, it was kind of insane, almost laughable to imagine two black people on the Supreme Court. And in private circles, there were often conversations about the riskiness of having two black people on the Supreme Court. Well, now that's going to become a reality. And those two black people have very different political orientations. They think about the law, they think about justice, they think about American society and values radically differently, even though they come from the same racial community and in fact have very similar backgrounds. So we're going to see, I think, a number of historic events, a number of historic moments that come out of the simple nomination of a black woman to the Supreme Court for the first time in the court's entire history.
So let me ask you this, Leah, as you look at her background and we learn more about her, we listened to how humble she was today and what she told the American people, yet she did get pushback from members of Congress even before her nomination. Republicans criticizing the president for his vow to nominate the first black woman to the highest court. What do you think this says about where we are as a country right now?
Well, I think a lot of the pushback that Brown Jackson received is what we might call cynical political posturing. We know that we're in a highly polarized and partisan environment, and that in fact, any nominee that Biden put forward was going to result in some kind of pushback, some kind of challenge. You know, certainly there would be degrees of challenges. Do we put up a significant fight or do we put up a little bit of a fight? So that does matter. But we knew that anyone that was going to be put forward, even kind of the most mundane, the most neutral of appointments, would receive challenge. The other thing to keep in mind, I think, here, though, is that at no point in time have the people putting forward Supreme Court nominees not considered things like gender, race, religious orientation, all of those things, and backroom private dealings. All of those things have always been on the table, particularly at a period in time where people, because of their race, because of their skin color, because of their sexual orientation, were banned from participating in the nomination process or excluded from participating in the political process. So these kinds of conversations, in fact, are not new. They're not different from old. But I do think that it matters, in fact, that Brown-Jackson has actually come before Congress, has come before Republicans, and has made her way through the process, very similar process, although certainly not this public, but has made her way through similar processes with very little pushback. But I do think, and it's going to be important to pay attention to this, that it's a signal, the challenges that she's receiving, it's a signal for how partisan and how polarized we are in this moment.
Well, and that leads me to my next question. This was Biden's campaign promise, right? Why do you think that this Supreme Court nomination took so long in the first place?
Well, there are a number of things, and there are a number of reasons that go into selecting a Supreme Court justice. But when it comes to Black women, historically, when a Black woman's name has even been brought up in the circle of the Supreme Court, there is a way in which, by virtue of that person being a Black woman, they are invalidated. So Black women are seen as less than. They are seen as unqualified, even though they are often overqualified for the position. They have to jump through far more hurdles, as we've seen, because of the fact that this is the first time in the Supreme Court's history that a Black woman has come forward, has even made it this far in the process. So one of the things that we're seeing here, and I think that is worth acknowledging beyond the symbolism, beyond the symbolic value of this appointment, is the very real action of righting a wrong that has persisted despite progress, despite legislation, despite significant changes in public opinion. So righting a wrong and making right something that has been long overdue. So here is a Black woman who is highly qualified, in fact, again, overqualified, who is finally going to be put forward as deserving to be on the highest court of the land, most powerful court of the land.
Well, times are definitely a-changing, and as we say that and witness that, how do you think just the overall impact will be, this nomination, what it will have just on Black women everywhere in all types of professions?
Well, the largest impact that it's going to have is deeply symbolic, but I want to emphasize that the symbolism of putting a Black woman in a space where Black women have long been excluded, even banned, denied, even though that's incredibly symbolic and powerful, there's also a way in which it is deeply significant, because it is essentially the breaking down of barriers, pre-existing barriers that have persisted for generations. So it suggests that Black women, in fact, don't have to go through these hurdles, have to jump through these loops. It is a shattering of the glass ceiling, not just for gender, but also of race. So that is incredibly important. But I also think at a moment where the Supreme Court has been besieged by questions of partisanship, of political bias, of problematics, right, of enormous drama, the likes of which we have not seen in several generations, that Brown-Jackson, I think, appointment could be a very significant and bright light for the court. That, in fact, it can be representative of the possibilities, right, of democracy and how things can work when we work together and when we right historic wrongs.
Dr. Leah Wright-Rigueur, always great talking to you, especially on a day like today. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Let's bring in senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katersky in Ukraine, foreign correspondent James Longman in Moscow, and White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks in Washington for more. Aaron, I want to start with you. The Kremlin is now claiming that President Zelensky of Ukraine has said he's ready to discuss neutral status for Ukraine and that Vladimir Putin is prepared to send a delegation to Belarus to hold talks there. How credible do you think that claim is?
Well, we're not sure whether that's a stall tactic or whether there really are conditions that could be met to end the fighting through negotiation. It doesn't seem like it so far, given the aerial bombardment we saw of Kyiv and its outskirts today and some of the heavy fighting within the city limits. Right now, it's believed that Russian forces are resupplying and reinforcing, getting ready to try and encircle the capital of Ukraine within the next 24 to 48 hours. But whatever pause there may be, we're not sure that's going to be enough for negotiations. Vladimir Putin was on Russian television talking about some of the conditions that the Ukrainian military could possibly he almost urged them toward mutiny, it seemed, and we're not sure that that's going to be the kind of condition under which negotiations can take place. If, as the Russian foreign minister said, the Ukrainian military would have to lay down arms before there could be any talk, the Ukrainian military is only spurring more people to take up arms, urging any able-bodied person to grab a gun and join the resistance. The Ukrainians have been fighting fierce battles in different parts of the country, but they're under no illusions about the power of the Russian military. President Zelensky, in a message directly to them, said, "You're all we've got." He's been appealing to the West for more, but no Western nation is going to commit boots on the ground here. And so Zelensky told his military, "You're all we have defending the country."
And James, as Aaron mentioned, Vladimir Putin is again speaking on Russian TV. What's his latest message today?
Well, it's more of the same, Diane. He's actually on television right now speaking to his National Security Council. It's televised again. That's only the second time that's ever happened. And, I mean, one of those quotes actually appeared, forgive me, rather deranged. He said, "Don't allow neo-Nazis to use your children, wives and elderly as human shields." He's talking to the Ukrainian military here. As Aaron was saying, this is an appeal to mutiny. To take power into your hands, it seems like it will be easier to negotiate with you than this gang of drug addicts and neo-Nazis who have say in Kiev and have taken hostage the whole Ukrainian people. So this is just more of the narrative from the Russian government that the whole of Ukraine is run apparently by Nazis and that it's really important that they intervene to stop what they've repeated is a possible genocide. Now, it's worth saying that these sorts of messages have been not just repeated for the last few days and weeks, but this is the kind of message that Russians have been hearing for the last 8 years of the war that's been kind of bubbling on, I suppose is the word to use, down in the eastern part of Ukraine. And it's just, you know, it's a sentiment that Russians will have kind of just understood for so long because they have no other way of getting other information. I was on the streets last night with a lot of young people who have come out to protest. They're angry at these sorts of messages. They know where to get other information. They're on the internet. They are on social media. They have understood really what is going on, and they're angry that their country has been taken to war and that this is the impression that the world has of them. And so, you know, I think we're just going to hear more and more of this until perhaps some kind of negotiated settlement, but it's, you know, I think it's too early to talk about that yet. So, yeah, we'll see what happens.
And Aaron, how close are Russian forces at this point to the capital, and what kind of resistance can Ukraine mount in Kyiv?
Well, the Ukrainians believe that they can hold off the Russian forces in some spots, and they've been putting out messages claiming that they've inflicted a good deal of pain on the Russian military. But the Russians say they have now effectively cut off the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv from the west and could start to soon begin to encircle the city. They're very close. They're within the city limits, and it's believed there may now be a pause in the bombardment and the fighting to allow for resupply and reinforcements to come in. We're told that of all of the troops that President Putin had massed along the border, only a fraction have actually crossed it so far, and they have very swiftly, within 36 hours, not even, managed to get to the doorstep of the capital. the Ukrainians are taking up arms and these instructions to build Molotov cocktails to make bombs out of bottles, that could sow the seeds of an insurgency that lasts here for a very long time and make the conflict that much longer and that much bloodier.
And Mary Alice, several of President Biden's top national security team members were seen at the White House this morning. Any news on what's being discussed there?
Now, we know that the president was also going to meet today with NATO partners. You know, there's a big talk about whether more troops should be sent to reinforce the NATO eastern flank and whether NATO itself would sort of call for that, would put in place a rapid response force and specifically ask for NATO members to send additional troops. I asked the White House about that yesterday. Jen Psaki said that would still be a decision that NATO together as an alliance would make. So we're waiting to hear about what their next steps are. And they're obviously also working on this pending humanitarian crisis and refugee crisis. You know, I asked the White House yesterday whether the 17 members of an that were activated as sort of an emergency response force to head to Poland to help with the humanitarian response was remotely enough, if we could be looking at tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people trying to cross that border. They said no, it was just the first step.
All right, Aaron Katersky, James Longman, Mary Alice Parks, thank you.
Let's check in now with Faith Abube, who is in D.C. with the headlines. Hey there, Faith.
Hey, good afternoon to you, TJ. We have breaking news right now out of Washington. President Biden announcing his choice to fill the open U.S. Supreme Court seat, choosing 51-year-old Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to be the next Associate Justice. The U.S. Court of Appeals judge is the first black woman to be nominated to sit on the nation's highest court. And now to the global crisis overseas. Fierce fighting across Ukraine. Russian forces closing in on Kyiv. Some families there taking shelter underground using subway tunnels as bomb shelters. Thousands fleeing the advancing Russian troops. Our senior foreign correspondent Ian Pannell reporting firefights breaking out there in the capital city. And new concerns about President Zelensky's safety. He says he's Russia's target number one. His family is in hiding. The Ukrainian president calling on men between 18 and 60 years old to fight. Meanwhile, protests are intensifying worldwide, even in Moscow, against Russia's effort to rewrite the global map with force, the U.S. imposing severe new sanctions on Russia. President Biden saying they may take some time to be fully felt, but he says America stands up to bullies. And 3 former Minneapolis police officers found guilty of violating George Floyd's civil rights. They were with former officer Derek Chauvin the day he forced his knee on Floyd's neck, killing him. The all-white federal jury finding the former officers deprived Floyd of his civil rights when they failed to offer medical aid, rejecting their claims of inexperience and improper training. And finally, look for this famous couple in the spotlight at the 53rd NAACP Image Awards happening this weekend in Los Angeles. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, they are receiving the President's Award for their distinguished public service, and TJ specifically for their work toward social justice in the U.S. and around the world. TJ.
All right, Faith, thank you. And thank you for being with us this week. We appreciate it. You have a good weekend, all right? We'll see you soon.
Thank you, you too.
President Biden said yesterday that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to a, quote, complete rupture in U.S.-Russia relations. And for some in Moscow, it's also led to a divide, with some even daring to protest Putin's military moves. ABC's James Longman is in Moscow with the latest on how the people of Russia are reacting.
Sadness and shock in Russia. The government says most people support Vladimir Putin's war, but in Moscow, protesters risked arrest to show their opposition to it.
Hundreds of people were on this street earlier here in downtown Moscow to protest the decision by Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine. They don't feel that this is a man that represents their interests, and they're just taken away, put in these trucks over here. You can see the riot police in blue. There have been over 1,000 arrests across the country, in fact, at protests like these in over 50 cities. A large number of people here in Russia do believe what Vladimir Putin says because they've been watching and listening a lot of the state-controlled media. But for these mostly young people here, it takes a special kind of bravery to protest in Vladimir Putin's Russia, especially on the day that he goes to war. So why are you here, ladies? Why have you come?
We would like to support our friends in Ukraine, and not only we're just against the war in any kinds of this. That's why. That is the reason.
Do you feel scared being here?
Yes, a little bit.
I mean,
shame for our government.
Blasts were heard around Kiev as Russia launched its major invasion into Ukraine. It came after Putin addressed the nation, announcing a special military operation against Ukraine, saying there was no other option. While students protest in the street, some of Russia's cultural elite added their voice online. Famous Russian actors and presenters are putting up black squares on their Instagram profiles. Fear and pain, no to war, one late-night show host has written. Students on the street and celebrity criticisms are irritations the Kremlin can ignore. But it's making sure the wider public is fed a very specific message. Russian state TV is trying to dampen the tone.
Oh, well, lies have a habit of catching up with you in the end.
Because even Putin's supporters, many ordinary Russians, regard Ukraine with real affection. Many will have felt uneasy about an attack on their southern neighbor.
so would you be upset if there was an invasion?
Yes, definitely, yes.
That's why the messaging over this war has been so tightly controlled. It's not being called an invasion. The government says only Ukraine's military is in its sights, and there's a pledge not to kill civilians. The media overseer has even said outlets will be fined if they don't report what official Russian sources are saying. But many Russians aren't interested in war, especially if looming sanctions cripple the economy. An independent poll released by the Levada Center on Thursday shows that only 45% of Russians supported recognition of the separatist states in Ukraine. For students like Albina and Maria, the war means their futures are thrown into yet more uncertainty.
We don't support our government, and we don't have any direct channel how to say it.
If you want to fight for your future, you need to speak up.
Would you have a message for Ukrainians if they're watching?
We respect Ukraine. We think that Ukraine is a really nation, and we don't choose this way. We want just peace.
And James joins me live now from Moscow. James, what have you seen from these protests there in Russia? Because it seems like from what you described, there's a divide depending on the age group you're talking to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, in Moscow, we saw hundreds out. St. Petersburg, there were thousands on the street, and more than 50 towns and cities across the country. There have been a huge number of arrests. At this point, over 1,700 arrests. That is a large number in sort of a 24-hour period in Russia, because people just can't protest here. Vladimir Putin's Russia has become a place where public protest is almost basically impossible. Some of the young people I've met have spoken about exactly that their parents, their grandparents feel one way and they feel another, and that's purely because of the media that they watch and consume. Russian state media, Russian language media, has a very clear message. It is controlled by the government. There is a watchdog here. Censorship is what I think we would call it, which tells them basically what to think. And younger people who are kind of perhaps more clued in with the rest of the world, very definitely have access to the internet and social media, they are understanding something slightly different. And I've got to say, it was kind of heartbreaking speaking to these young people out on the street yesterday, because they're just young and modern and cool and just kind of kids who really, really want a future like everyone else and absolutely deserve one. And they're watching what's happening now and realizing that their future is really uncertain. The sanctions that are coming in now are going to bite. They might not bite Putin that hard. They've affected some of the oligarchs, but when you're making billions and billions of dollars a year, it might not be that much of a problem for you. But regular people will feel this, and it's young people who will feel it a lot, because, you know, I had one kid yesterday talking to me saying, what am I going to do? I was going to study abroad, that my visas are going to be cancelled now. Electronics, the price of electronics has gone up by something like 30% overnight. Can't use an iPhone, for instance. iPhones probably won't be sold here. Apple Pay is probably going to stop working. Things like this, you don't think about it, but and all this is crippling for a young generation who enjoy being part of a modern economy and a modern country. And they're seeing that slip away. Dan?
So how do you think the Russian people will react as this war continues to unfold? Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. I think the Kremlin is very, very conscious about that. At the moment, they are phrasing this war as being packaged as a defensive
military operation, not an invasion. If you look at what's actually happening in Ukraine at the moment, Russian troops are not occupying territory, they're moving through it. So the expectation, the possibility is that what Vladimir Putin plans to do is force political change in Ukraine and then get out. If he can do that, he keeps his people on side. If not, people start to wonder what exactly it is that Russia is doing there, because Ukraine is not some foreign distant nation which this country has nothing to do with. A lot of people in Russia have very close ties with people in Ukraine. So it doesn't matter how controlled the media messaging is, people will get to know the truth, which is that if the truth is that in days and weeks of long occupation and a bloody war and lots of Russian troops dying, people will start to lose faith in their leader. So that is a big part of the reason why Vladimir Putin probably wants to get this done sooner rather than later.
All right, James Longman for us in Moscow. Thanks, James.
President Biden and G7 leaders responding to the Russian invasion of Ukraine with what the White House is calling a devastating package of sanctions. We're going to discuss that. But before we get to Ukraine, we're going to talk about the news of President Biden's pick for Supreme Court Justice Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. Our Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas is here with us now. And yes, let's start. We're inviting you here to talk about these cyber attacks. So we're getting this news now that Biden has made his pick.
Indeed, TJ, historic pick. The first time a black woman would serve on the court if confirmed. Think about all those attorneys, women of color who waited for this day. My wife, in fact, is a black woman, an attorney, and she had talked about this pick with pride. So this means something to a lot of people. Now, she is living up to the promise of President Biden, who said that he was going to pick a black woman for the Supreme Court when he was on the campaign trail. She's a former clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer, who's retiring. So she's a person who has a great deal of qualifications. But of course, you know, TJ, confirmation in Washington is always a prickly matter. But there is some feeling that she could get some bipartisan support. So we'll just have to see how it plays out, TJ.
No, but still, it's worth noting what the history here is. What a historic pick, a historic day. But let's get back to what we've been talking about: Ukraine, Russia, these possible Russian cyber attacks. Many will tell us that they're already taking place, at least in the region, that they're attacking Ukraine. Well, literally attacking, but also these cyber attacks. But what happens with the U.S. if Russia decides to launch cyber attacks against the U.S.? What could that look like?
But TJ, we're talking about infiltrating or disrupting computer networks. It can allow hackers to target the electrical grid where power could be shut off. Hackers, in theory, can cause a water treatment plant to malfunction, impede your ability to use an ATM. There's also concern about mobile and communication networks. The list is potentially endless.
You say and impede your, I guess a lot of Americans' ears, our viewers' ears would perk up. Like, I would have a difficult time even accessing my own money in an ATM. So is there anything the average American could do right now to protect yourself besides changing a couple of passwords?
Well, the main thing that you can do is to be careful when you get what we call a phishing email. Do not open any kind of attachment whatsoever if it's not from someone that you know.
Again, we have to prepare kind of worst case scenarios, but we don't want to scare people. But you said kind of the list of possible disruptions is endless, but things like gas and food, could we be looking at things like that being in some way impacted?
TJ, let me show you something. We went to a place called Dreamport, which marries experts from the U.S. Cyber Command, private industry, and academia. We have video of this place, I think, which houses a small model city. They used real live computer servers in the same way a full-scale city would. It was shocking to see what the hackers could do. We saw them shut off power for part of that city, turn off traffic lights, flood a park, and remember, this city uses the same kind of computer networks that a regular city would use.
Oh, wow. ABC Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas handling two big stories for us, like you always do. You always stay nimble. You handle anything we can throw at you. And you're welcome here on GMA3 anytime. We love having you here, man. Thanks so much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
The market is about to open on Wall Street as Ukraine and the invasion happening in Ukraine impacts stocks across the world. Here's a live look at the opening bell, the New York Stock Exchange there. All three major indexes closed up yesterday, and oil prices have dropped slightly, hovering back around $100 a barrel. Again, just awaiting that opening bell on Wall Street today. But let's bring in economic correspondent Deirdre Bolton for more on how this invasion is affecting the economy. Deirdre, it seems to be a little bit all over the place. So what do you think we can expect to see in the days ahead, both on Wall Street and in our everyday lives?
Diane, you said it's a little bit all over the place. That's the tone, definitely for stocks. If we talk about Wall Street, we could talk about Main Street in a minute. But as for stocks, so people who participate in the markets, just expect more volatility. This is the way that it's going to be. So you saw those incredibly wild swings yesterday. I mean, the S&P 500 was down at its lowest point around 2.5%. Finishing the day up by 1.5%. So it just shows you these swings. Very headline-driven news, of course, on everything that's going on in Ukraine. This morning, I want to highlight very, very early this morning, we actually had futures poised for a much lower open. There is a headline that came through Interfax about an hour ago saying that China has scheduled a call with Russia. And so that actually seemed to move the futures. And now, to your point with that opening bell, we do see markets moving higher. For Main Street, it's a lot more of a cautious outlook because Russia, as we know, is a large oil-producing nation. So any, let's say, taking out of supply, subtraction of supply is going to affect us all. So if you look at the national average price of gasoline, right now it's about $3.50 per gallon. It is likely we're going to hit that $4 per gallon mark pretty soon if oil prices stay as high as they are in the markets. And Diane, you know this affects everyday Americans almost more than anything else. And unfortunately, prices at the pump really affect the lowest earners in our country because they are the ones who are paying the highest percentage of what they have in their pocket to get where they need to go. And a lot of times that is work. Diane.
Now, we were already seeing historic inflation before this Russian invasion. So how do you think this attack could affect prices on things like groceries while people are already paying more for gas?
It's a great question. Unfortunately, I think the price of most things goes even higher. You said it, inflationary pressures. We are seeing inflation rise pre-Russian invasion to a 40-year high at the fastest pace in 40 years. Overall prices up 7.5%. But I go to the groceries, I see the prices that are there. Bacon is up 18%, peanut butter is up 15%. So there's a lot of items that a lot of Americans use or eat every day, or at least once a week, that are much more than 7.5% higher. But what happens with these higher fuel costs that we just talked about, whether it's gasoline in our cars or whether it's the diesel that food manufacturers use when they contract trucking companies to bring groceries to supermarkets, that's more expensive. We are the ones collectively who end up paying more for those higher energy prices. Also consider home heating bills, for example. Jet fuel prices, it is quite likely that airline travel gets more expensive if these airline companies pass along these higher costs of jet fuel, in the case of the airline companies, to us, again, the consumers who will be buying, in theory, airline tickets, Diane.
And Deirdre, we've already seen some sanctions on Russia. Those could continue to pile up. So what side effects could these new sanctions have?
Well, these new sanctions, of course, the hope is that it curbs Russia's thirst to keep going with this invasion, and it curbs its appetite to do more. There are a lot of people that I'm speaking with who somewhat cynically say that perhaps the sanctions that we have placed so far are not enough, meaning that gold has gone higher. Russia has a disproportionate holding of gold. Gold is up something like $200 to $250 an ounce. And also oil has spiked. We saw it close over, or rather touch about $100 a barrel yesterday. That is another product that actually is helpful to the Russian economy. So in some ways, at least in the past 48 to 72 hours, at least two of the products that Russia has, as far as the markets go, Russia has actually benefited from it, Diane.
And so how is the administration planning to tackle the economic fallout overall?
Well, the Biden administration was already fighting a war against inflation, and we heard the president speak about that. I know you're paying more for prices at the pump. I know that everything is more expensive. He talked a lot, of course, about trying to reach everyday Americans. The next really pivotal moment is what the Fed does in mid-March. So the Fed was scheduled to raise interest rates. Why do we care about that? Because it makes all borrowing more expensive. If you have credit cards, your payments become more expensive. For someone who's trying to buy a house, that mortgage becomes more expensive. To get a car loan becomes more expensive. So that is the next turning point, at least for our economic story. What is the Fed going to do with this information, do with the fact that we are seeing inflation at a 40-year high, but we do have this huge X factor in the markets, which is this invasion by Russia into Ukraine. Diane.
All right, Deirdre Bolton, we appreciate it. Deirdre, thank you. American Myron Wasilek and his wife decided to leave Wednesday night after talking to friends at the U.S. and European embassies. Now, they arrived to a safe location just as bombs started exploding throughout the country early Thursday. And Myron is joining me live with more. Myron, first of all, we're thinking of you and your family so much right now. How are you? How are you all doing? How are you holding up right now?
We're doing well. Our eyes are glued into what's going on in Kyiv. Today is an intense battle for the control of Kyiv. And we've seen the fighting started today at 5 a.m. It's almost 5 p.m. And we've heard the reports from the Ukrainian armed forces that today is probably the worst day in the Russian troop history. About 1,000 Russian troops were killed today as they tried to take the city, and fighting continues quite intensely in most of the major urban centers. So it's a very intense day, and the battle continues for the control of the capital. We've seen that sabotage groups of the Russian forces have been basically flying into the capital city to take over the government. Many have been killed and shot in the streets. So it's an intense battle that will go right into the night.
How hard was it for you to make the decision to leave your home in Kyiv?
It was a tough decision. We sat down with my wife and decided that we needed to get out before the traffic jams started. Both of us are involved in government, and so we decided that we needed to have a clear passageway so that we can get to our location and continue doing our work.
And so take us through the past 48 hours. What was it like evacuating? What is it like now watching this from afar?
Well, I think that, first it's a little bit shocking, and it's a little bit, you become somewhat disheveled, but then you basically, you gather your senses, and then you become motivated and you continue moving forward. So it's quite intense, and we're doing our work here, working with the embassies, working with the media, and getting the word out about what's happening on the ground.
And I know you work for the Ukrainian oil and gas company, Naftogaz. How is this crisis affecting the infrastructure and gas in Ukraine?
Well, the infrastructure is actually doing okay. We've had some minor incursions in the eastern regions, but the gas flowing through Ukraine to Europe continues without any type of crisis at this point. We see that there may be some diversionary or sabotage groups that will try to pull something in the near future, in the next couple of days. But right now, we're working with police, with the territorial groups. We're working with the armed forces, and the pipeline is safe and flowing gas to Europe.
How worried are you about your safety, your wife's safety, and what do you want people watching right now to know?
I think that we basically need additional support. We need more sanctions on the Russian. We need to raise the costs on the Russians. We are raising the costs on the ground for the Russians, but we need the international community to raise with sanctions that will really stop them. The sanctions against SWIFT, sanctions against the Central Bank of Russia, that will really put basically a dent in the financing of this military campaign. Without that, this can go on. But on the ground, we're raising the cost for Russian soldiers. 1,000 dead today. More will be dead tomorrow. So I'm sure that Putin is not liking what he's hearing from the ground in Ukraine. So we need to keep going.
And I know that right now you're kind of in go mode. I know you work for the government, as you said, and there's a lot going on for you and your wife in terms of professionally trying to help what's happening in this crisis. But what is it like for you when you kind of put that hat down and start thinking about yourselves personally?
It's tough to talk about personally. We have a job to do, and we're communicators, and we need to get the word out. So we're working.
All right. Well, again, your family is in our thoughts and in our prayers, and we're hoping that you stay safe and an end to this comes soon. Thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too. I'd like to bring in the president of the board of directors at the Ukrainian National Museum of Chicago, Lydia Kachuk. Lydia, thank you for being here. I know your parents migrated from Ukraine after World War II in the 1950s, but you do still have family there. So how are they doing and how are you feeling?
Yes, I have quite a bit of family. I have family in Kyiv, and most of my family is in Western Ukraine. Well, I try to call them on a daily basis to see how they're doing. And just before this call today, I called my cousin's husband in Kyiv because he has, his wife and children have moved to Western Ukraine. And he said that he's enlisted today and his brother-in-law has enlisted to fight. And he also mentioned that some of my family in Western Ukraine have enlisted also.
How does that make you feel, particularly, after seeing the invasion start, seeing this all unfold, now hearing that your own family members are enlisting to fight in this battle?
Well, I'm proud that they're willing to fight in the battle. But, on the other hand, you think that, if they get killed, their families then lose a father, a brother. It's very difficult because we're here. We're in a free country. And when I speak to them, they are a bit disappointed about Europe helping them, even the U.S., the fact that they gave up their nuclear warfare and they were guaranteed assistance. And then everyone is sort of going back on their word.
Now, we just heard in Stephanie's piece how Americans are helping Ukrainians. So what's your best advice on what people outside Ukraine can do?
Well, people outside, I think they should rally more for more assistance for Ukraine. And I think they should implement the sanctions that the president has spoken about. Because if we don't implement them quickly, things will only escalate. And we've seen how quickly things have turned around. I mean, when you think of it, Ukraine has been crying out for help since 2018, and no one has really been paying attention since 2014, and no one has been paying attention. When Crimea was annexed, everyone just went about their own business. And even the NATO countries, they won't realize that it might be tomorrow when they will be invaded.
So what do you think the future of Ukraine looks like?
Probably a week ago, I said that everything would be okay. I don't know, now it looks quite dismal, even though I know that Ukrainians are very determined and they will fight for their freedom. And now I'm a bit skeptical as to what will happen to Ukraine.
And Vladimir Putin came out saying that President Zelensky has offered negotiations over neutral status of Ukraine. We, of course, don't know how credible that information is from Vladimir Putin and whether Zelensky actually did make that offer. But what's your reaction to hearing about that possibility?
I don't believe it. I don't believe that they had such a conversation.
All right. Lydia Kachuk, we appreciate your time today and hoping your family is able to stay safe. Kremlin is now claiming President Zelensky of Ukraine has said that he's ready to discuss neutral status for Ukraine and that Vladimir Putin is prepared to send a delegation to Belarus to hold talks there. So let's bring in White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks and security contributor Colonel Steve Ganyard for more on that. Mary Alice, I want to start with you. How credible do you think this news from Vladimir Putin is that President Zelensky is considering negotiations now?
Well, Diane, first, I think we need to be incredibly skeptical of any information coming out of the Kremlin. We've seen just an outpouring of disinformation from the Kremlin over the last several days, several weeks. And of course, Russia would want Ukraine to surrender. They're engaged in a full-on assault. Their end goal would be for Ukraine to surrender and come to the negotiating table. It was interesting that overnight, President Zelensky of Ukraine did say, let's sit at the table for negotiations to stop people dying. The fighting is ongoing all over Ukraine. Clearly, he is also pleading for some negotiations. He doesn't want a war to destroy his entire country either. But he did not call for his forces to lay down their arms or to surrender at this point. So I think we have to watch this hour by hour. And again, I think we have to be pretty skeptical right now about what exactly is coming out of the Kremlin.
And Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, has called over and over again for Ukraine troops to put down their weapons, saying, you know, that they mean no harm, they don't intend to attack, but also putting that message out as Russian troops were marching in. So what do you think this message, at least what Vladimir Putin is referring to as neutral status, what do you think he means by that?
Yeah, he wants guarantees that the Ukrainian government will not join NATO, probably guarantees that the Ukrainian government will step down. I mean, we've seen this effort to try to choke out the Ukrainian leadership, and incredible frustration from Putin and from the Kremlin that President Zelensky has been so willing to align himself with the West, you know, has been moving towards a stronger democracy, has been having closer sort of ties and relationships with Western allies and Western countries, and has enjoyed military support, financial support from the United States over the last several years. All of that is what has frustrated Putin, which led to sort of this tipping point, this unbelievable invasion that we're seeing. President Putin thinking that if he couldn't get his way politically in Ukraine, he would try to take it by force. So I think that we have to be very careful looking into the idea of any possible negotiations between these two leaders when we are still seeing fighting and missiles flying in the streets.
And Steve, it seems the leading theory is that Russia wants to install their own government in Ukraine, or at least a Russia-friendly government there. How would that work exactly? And what do you make of this latest announcement from Putin?
Yeah, Diane, I think what they would really prefer to have is a puppet government that they could put into Kyiv and to basically be at the beck and call of Moscow. We're watching their forces this morning continue to encircle Kyiv with the intent of pressuring the government and bringing down the fall of the government. But these recent announcements this morning, where we're hearing both the Ukrainians and the Russians say, okay, let's talk. But the real key here is the term neutral status. It's important to look at geography to understand this idea of neutral status. After the fall of the Soviet Union, after Russia sort of was off on its own, and you had Ukraine as now as an independent country, many of the former Russian parts of the Soviet Union joined NATO, and so all of this strategic buffer that Mr. Putin had went away. And so, especially since 2014, you've had Ukraine at least attempt to turn into a vibrant democracy. And they have been making comments about how they want to join NATO and how they want to join the European Union. And this makes Mr. Putin very nervous because he sees the U.S. as a tool of he sees NATO as a tool of the U.S., meaning that would put U.S. forces on the very edge of Russia. That makes Mr. Putin nervous, and it's one of the reasons that he has gone in and invaded Ukraine, is that he wants to put it, you know, make Ukraine much more neutral at least, and at best he wants to make it a puppet vassal state of Moscow.
And Mary Alice, there's a NATO meeting being held today. What are we expecting from that?
Yeah, the NATO allies trying to decide what comes next, how in the world they might be able to respond to this if they're not going to, engage militarily inside Ukraine's borders. At what point do they draw up a NATO response force? You know, we've seen the U.S. sending more U.S. troops to the eastern flank of NATO to try to reinforce and bolster NATO, the NATO allies there. But the question is, what comes next? Could there be spillover? You know, we heard President Biden and Jen Psaki yesterday from the White House both say that they are concerned that President Putin could continue marching past Ukraine. Well, at what point then does he come face to face with NATO forces? What does that mean? What would that look like? You know, I asked the White House yesterday, what about a cyber attack? What if a cyber attack lobbied by Russia was to impact a NATO country? Would that trigger a response from the entire NATO alliance? So far, we've seen NATO trying to respond collectively as a unified bloc. That is getting harder to do. They are really feeling the pressure right now to figure out what any kind of response to Putin at this point looks like.
And Steve, I want to go back to this question of neutral status, because you did such a good job there of explaining sort of why Russia would want that. What would neutral status mean for Ukraine?
That is the $64,000 question. So the other thing that the Kremlin said this morning when they said Zelensky wanted to discuss neutral status is that Russia insists on the denazification of Ukraine. So as far as we know, there's no active Nazi movement or Nazis in Ukraine. So what does this mean? Is that a negotiating tool where the Kremlin will designate people that they say are Nazis that need to be eliminated within the country? So lots of questions on how this negotiation will go. But hopefully, there's a discussion here that could bring an end to this conflict fairly quickly.
All right, well, I think a lot of people hoping for that right now. Steve Ganyard, Mary Alice Parks, we appreciate it. Thank you. President Biden has nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. I want to get right to our Devin Dwyer and Mary Alice Parks for more on this. Devin, this is a historic pick, so walk us through who is Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson.
Yeah, Diane, a historic pick. No African-American woman has ever been nominated to the United States Supreme Court before. Only 2 justices of color have ever sat on that bench. And now 2 years to the day when, after President Biden made that promise to elevate an African-American woman to the court, he has announced that Judge Jackson is his pick. Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, 51 years old, as you said, on the younger side of the spectrum. She's an experienced federal judge. This is someone that has sat on the bench for 8 years, confirmed to the District D.C. Circuit Court just last year, Diane, with Republican support. So the president here clearly going for experience. And she's been vetted by the Senate 3 times already with Republican votes. She was put on the district court back in 2013 by the Obama administration. She served on the Sentencing Commission, and then last year onto the D.C. Circuit Court. So this is someone with experience, an elite legal pedigree, but also has been a public defender. For 2.5 years out of law school at Harvard Law, she defended everyday Americans, those convicted of drug crimes, violent crimes, civil penalties in federal courts, and that is a rare experience. The Supreme Court has never had anyone on the bench that has had as significant criminal defense experience. So she will bring a diversity of experience as well. That is something that this president has prized, and so this is really a very significant moment.
And Mary Alice, what went into this decision by President Biden?
Look, President Biden was excited to make a historic pick here, and I think he did want to make sure that his nominee would be able to receive some bipartisan support. And as Devin mentioned, she received bipartisan support just last year. 3 Republicans voting with Democrats to confirm her to the very high-profile D.C. Circuit Court. So she's just recently been through this process. President Biden had decided he liked her enough to give her that big promotion. So clearly he has a personal relationship with her at this point, and clearly feels good about the prospects that Republicans will again, hopefully, in his mind, be willing to cross the line and vote to confirm her again. You know, and as Devin was hitting at, she kind of checks all of the boxes with background and experience. She both grew up in Washington, D.C., and then Florida and Miami with this, public school education growing up, but then went on to Harvard College, and then Harvard Law, sort of had these extremely top posts, these traditional posts. She was a former clerk to Justice Stephen Breyer, whose seat she obviously would be filling. So she is has the background you'd expect that is very exciting to this White House. And I think they're hoping they're going to be able to make a really strong appeal on Capitol Hill.
Interesting to have it come full circle from her working for Breyer to now being nominated to replace him. Devin, any hang-ups that might present an issue for this nomination?
Republicans have scrutinized her pretty thoroughly, Diane. I mean, just less than a year ago, they queried her. I have studied that confirmation hearing to see the lines of attacks that could come. She has faced questions about how race will factor in her decisions, her affiliation with liberal, legal, progressive groups, some questions about her time as a public defender. In fact, she defended one of the Guantanamo Bay detainees. Of course, it was assigned to her, but some Republicans will make hay about that. So her record is going to be scrutinized, but there's not a lot there since she's been was confirmed to the bench just a year ago. She's only authored 1 opinion on the appeals court. She's joined a number of opinions. And we should say that she will probably also be scrutinized, Diane, for some of her opinions ruling against former President Donald Trump, including that decision, unanimous decision by the appeals court, affirmed by the Supreme Court, that the president must turn over his records to the January 6th committee.
All right, Mary Alice Parks, Devin Dwyer, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Ian Panel starts us off from Kyiv. Good morning, Ian. Yeah, good morning, George. A lot of fast-moving developments overnight and this morning. The head of Ukraine's armed forces announcing in the last few hours, today Ukraine needs everything. All procedures for joining are simplified. All you need is a passport or an ID, and quotes, there are no age restrictions. I have to say today the city is more on edge than ever before. We've seen firefights breaking out inside the city, and there are reports that the police and the military are just handing out weapons to civilians. And I have to say the city is now braced for what looks like the battle for Kyiv. Overnight, Russian forces closing in on Kyiv, explosions rocking the capital city. Images like this one circulating on social media. This morning, Ukrainian military police in full combat gear joining the fight to defend the city. The emergency services called into action after shelling overnight. Ukrainian President Zelensky in another urgent address to his country, saying saboteurs have already entered the capital and that Russia's named him target number 1, his family target number 2. They're now in hiding. Just 60 miles north of Kyiv, after fierce fighting, Russian forces reportedly now in control of Chernobyl, the destroyed nuclear power plant. From our position in Kyiv, we could see fighter jets overhead, with the city triggering its emergency air raid alarm. And just 20 miles away, Russian special forces in helicopters landing at a military base, which has been the scene of intense firefights. Videos posted on social media from inside Ukraine show these attacks unfolding as the Ukrainians mount a stiff defense. But the Russian onslaught is widespread, with missile strikes in the west, Ukrainian air bases aflame in the east, and fighter jets dropping bombs in the south, and clashes in the southern city of Sumy. The fighting on the ground has been intense. The Ukrainian president saying 137 Ukrainians have died. Ukrainian forces have been doing all they can to repel the more powerful Russian troops. But so far, sources telling ABC that not all of those 150,000 Russian troops on Ukraine's borders have crossed into the country. Russian state media showing these troops in the east. The Ukrainian military is now in the fight of its life. President Zelensky has now ordered a general mobilization, calling up men of fighting age and reservists. In the initial assault, Russia launching over 160 ballistic missiles at Ukrainian military targets. Some civilian areas were reportedly struck. The risk to civilians caught in the crossfire is extreme, with ordnance being fired almost at will by both sides. Those living in Ukraine now forced to deal with the reality of war unfolding around them. As bombs strike nearby, people are forced underground, turning subways into makeshift bomb shelters. And as Russian troops close in on the capital, thousands fleeing the city for safety, causing gridlock on major highways. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov saying this morning that they're ready for negotiations, but after Ukrainian troops surrender. And of course, right now, there is no sign of that. And I have to say, George, we're now entering the most dangerous hours so far in this war.
It is so
George?
clear, Ian. Hope you stay safe as well. Let's bring in our military analyst, Stephen Ganyard. So, Stephen, the Ukrainians say they're not going to surrender, but they clearly appear to be overmatched militarily.
Yeah, George, this is a very tense time because Zelensky's obviously going to come under pressure as these troops rush into the city. It's clear that the Russians are not intending to hold territory. They're moving very quickly. They're on tracked and wheeled vehicles. They're fighting where they have to. But right now it appears the Russians are racing to get to the leadership of the Ukrainian government. Pressure them. I think we're going to see disinformation throughout the day where the Russians are going to claim that the government is fleeing and that they're going to put in a puppet government. But this is the time where the capitulation pressure is highest, and Zelensky is going to be the target indeed, as Ian noted.
Target, I mean, he has to worry for his personal safety, doesn't he?
He does, but he needs to be worried about the future of Ukraine here because he needs something to negotiate with the Russians. They've made clear you surrender the whole army and then we'll talk. And those aren't terms that anyone can be pleased with.
No, they aren't. Okay, Stephen Ganyard, thanks very much.
何にもしなければ何でもない30分が変わった。こんばんは。
おうちで生レッスン今なら100円でトライ。それがソエル。
As Russian forces close in on the capital, tens of thousands of Ukrainians are racing to escape. Let's go to Matt Gutman in Poland, where many people are crossing the border as refugees. Good morning, Matt.
Hey, good morning, Michael. We were in this train station overnight, and 1,500 refugees came in here, many of them just sleeping on the floor. Just now, a train with 600 refugees pulled into the station. The UN says overall, over 100,000 people have been displaced so far by the violence.
This morning, for hundreds of Ukrainians, this train station in Poland is the first stop to safety. Overnight, parents holding their children's hands, children holding their stuffed animals. They brought only what they could carry. The ravenous gulping down soup, and it was there that we found Yulia. She left her mother behind, now alone.
Oh my God, I cried a lot.
Did you? You cried when you crossed in?
Yeah, I was forced to quit my country, and I didn't want it. It's like, if I want to cross my country, it should be my decision to quit my country, not that I have to.
Down the hallway, Anton and Maria, their baby son Lev, finally asleep on the cot.
30 hours. All the way in the east.
This train was so hot.
That's the area of some of the most intense fighting. They told me Lev cried for hours.
Do you think you will go back to Ukraine?
Maybe.
She says no. And it's no better in the land border. Talked to an American who's trying to cross there. He says the wait is 17 hours long. What's incredible here is how welcoming the Polish government has been. They have these centers where they're offering information and food, and have asked people why they're carrying just a couple of bags each. They say they hope to be able to go home soon. So, Lindsay.
Those kids with those stuffed animals, just so heart-wrenching. Matt Gutman, thanks so much. To Washington now, and the latest from President Biden calling Putin the aggressor and imposing new sanctions that he says will inflict a lot of economic pain. Our senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce has the very latest. Good morning, Mary.
Good morning, Lindsay. Well, the Western world is promising to hold Putin accountable for this invasion, imposing these harsh new economic sanctions. But President Biden seems to recognize there are limits to his power here, saying he knew these economic sanctions, the threat of them, would not be enough to stop Putin, and warning that it will take some time now for Russia to feel their effect. This morning, protests against Russia's invasion of Ukraine from Poland to Germany, London, and New York. Stand with Ukraine! As the U.S. and key allies strike back with severe sanctions, President Biden promising Vladimir Putin will pay a price for attacking Ukraine.
Putin is the aggressor. Putin chose this war, and now he and his country will bear the consequences.
The West preventing Russia from importing key technology, targeting members of Russia's elite, and what may be the most punishing, sanctioning 4 major Russian banks, freezing trillions of dollars of Russian assets. But as Russian forces move further into Ukraine, Biden cautioning it will take time for these sanctions to be felt.
This is going to take time. He's going to test the resolve of the West to see if we stay together, and we will. We will, and it will impose significant costs on him.
Biden, though, choosing not to sanction Putin directly, yet saying that option is still on the table. And as fears grow, Putin could push beyond Ukraine. Biden also ordering another 7,000 U.S. troops to support NATO forces in Eastern Europe.
He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union. That's what this is about.
Now, here at the White House, the president this morning is taking part in a virtual meeting with NATO leaders as they continue to present this united front against Russia. They are adamant that these sanctions will be costly, but Biden again warning that Americans here at home are going to feel this too. But Biden saying, quote, America stands up to bullies. We stand up for freedom. This is who we are. George.
Okay, Mary, thanks.